She was Daffney Unger, the Scream Queen, a pioneer who proved women could be just as hardcore as men, taking brutal, celebrated falls onto thumbtacks and barbed wire. But while the world cheered for the pain she performed, she was privately suffering from a pain no one could see, chronic migraines, crippling vertigo, and terrifying memory loss. When she took her own life on Instagram Live, she had one final desperate request. Check my brain for CTE? They did. The autopsy confirmed Daffney was the first female wrestler in history to be diagnosed with the disease. In a world of scripted pain, what happens when the most devastating injury is the one nobody can see? Shannon Spruill was born on July 17, 1975, at the Wiesbaden Army Airfield in West Germany. As the daughter of a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel, her life was defined from its first breath by a single term: military brat. This was not a childhood of stability. It was a nomadic existence dictated by her father's career, a life of constant upheaval and adaptation. The family's transfers were relentless. Salt Lake City in 1976, then Savannah, Georgia, then Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. This constant motion was punctuated by a 3-year stint in Oxford, England, and a return to Germany at Ramstein Air Base before her father finally retired in 1987. Such a transient life fosters a unique psychological profile. On one hand, it breeds an incredible adaptability, a chameleon-like ability to read a room, assimilate, and perform a new identity on command. On the other, it can create a profound and persistent lack of emotional roots. This background of constant adaptation and underlying instability is a critical lens through which to view her later official diagnosis of bipolar disorder in 2003. Amidst this, a flicker of the professional performer emerged early. In 1985, at age 10, she landed a tiny uncredited role as a bratty kid in the film Santa Claus, the movie. When her father retired, the family finally settled in Georgia. For the first time, Shannon had a permanent home. She pursued her artistic ambitions with focus. Enrolling at Georgia State University in 1998, she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Film and Video Production, minoring in both acting and music. This is a crucial, often overlooked fact. Shannon Spruill was not an aimless athlete who stumbled into wrestling. She was a trained actor and media professional. Her goal was a conventional career in film. After graduating, she began building that life, working in media production and as a personal trainer. However, her home of Atlanta was also the headquarters of World Championship Wrestling, WCW. In 1999, with the company losing the Monday Night War and desperate for new talent, WCW launched a contest for the 24-year-old GSU grad. This wasn't a whim. It was a professional audition for a role on national television, a chance to use her acting degree she entered, and she was selected. On December 6, 1999, Shannon Spruill debuted on WCW Nitro as Daffney. She was introduced as the deranged, unhinged girlfriend of David Flair, managing him and his chaotic partner Crowbar. The character was an immediate and shocking success, a gothic white trash fusion of natural-born killers and Harley Quinn, complete with her signature blood-curdling scream. This was not just a model in a weird outfit. This was a trained actor inhabiting a role, and her GSU training was on full display. To survive, she had to learn the craft. Sent to the brutal WCW power plant and training with veterans, she quickly proved her toughness. Her role evolved from manager to competitor. On May 22, 2000, in a move of pure, chaotic, late-stage WCW booking, Daffney pinned Crowbar to win the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It was a landmark moment. She was only the second woman in history, after Medusa, to hold the prestigious title. Though her reign was short, it cemented her in the history books. After a feud with Miss Hancock, Stacy Keibler, her meteoric rise hit a concrete wall. WCW was in a financial freefall. On February 2, 2001, Shannon was released as part of massive budget cuts. Just weeks later, WCW was sold to its rival, the WWF. At 25, in just over a year, she had gone from a film grad to a historic champion to unemployed. This was her first great rejection, but her military brat resilience kicked in. Instead of quitting, she went back to training, spending 8 months at Dusty Rhodes' Turnbuckle Championship Wrestling, TCW. She then toured the gritty independent scene to prove her versatility as Lucy, a nod to Lucy Fur. She managed in the bloody hardcore Extreme Pro Wrestling XPW. In a display of incredible range, she also worked for Ring of Honor, ROH, the mecca of pure wrestling, valeting the Second City Saints stable, which included a young CM Punk, with whom she began a personal relationship. Her hard work paid off. In July 2003, WWE signed her to a developmental contract and sent her to Ohio Valley Wrestling, OVW, their top training ground. This was her second chance, but she arrived at the worst possible time. This was the absolute height of the WWE Diva Search era. The company was not looking for 5'6" Gothic veteran wrestlers. They were looking for 5'10" models. Shannon, the trained actor and indie veteran, was the polar opposite of their ideal. On December 17, 2003, after just 5 months, she was released. This second rejection was devastating. It was a direct statement. Her look and style were not wanted. This professional blow coincided with a personal one. In 2003, she was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder. At 28, burned out, heartbroken, and exhausted, she retired. In a now poignant move, she sold her wrestling boots to an up-and-coming Mickie James. Shannon moved to Florida, returned to personal training, and tried once again to build a normal life. The Scream Queen was, for a time, silenced. She physically and symbolically severed ties with the business by selling her wrestling boots, the tools of her trade. The recipient of those boots was a young, ambitious, up-and-coming wrestler who was just starting her own journey, a woman named Mickie James. The irony would be profound. As Shannon stepped away, defeated, Mickie James would take those boots, or at least the symbolism they represented, to WWE, eventually becoming one of the most celebrated women's champions in the company's history, in part by playing a deranged character that felt like a spiritual successor to Daffney's own. Shannon moved to Florida, distancing herself from the industry's major hubs. She returned to the normal life she had been building before WCW ever called. She became a full-time personal trainer. She tried with all her might to silence the Scream Queen, to be just Shannon Spruill, a film graduate living in the Florida sun. But the ring, once it has its hooks in you, never truly lets go. The performer inside her, the trained actor who had minors in acting and music, was not built for a quiet life of 9 to 5. The stage in all its brutal, chaotic glory was calling her back. Her retirement lasted for nearly 2 years. By 2005, she began to tentatively dip her toe back into the water, but this time it would be on her own terms. She returned to the independent circuit, a world far from the corporate pressures of WWE, a world where she could control her character and her craft. Her most significant landing spot was Shimmer Women Athletes. Launched in 2005, Shimmer was not just another wrestling promotion, it was a revolution. In an era where WWE's female talent was relegated to 90-second bra and panties matches, Shimmer was a sanctuary. It was a promotion exclusively for women, built on the radical concept that female wrestling should be treated as a serious, athletic in-ring sport, identical in its presentation to the men's product. It was, in essence, the ring of honor for women, prioritizing work rate, character, and storytelling above all. When Daffney arrived in Shimmer in 2007, she wasn't immediately pushed as a top-level singles competitor. Instead, she was given a role that perfectly suited her GSU acting background. She became the manager for the equally eccentric and gothic Miss Chief. This was a masterstroke in character work. They were a perfect, unsettling pair, and her role as a manager, a talker, allowed her to perform without putting the same grueling daily toll on her body that had contributed to her burnout. It proved she was more than just a bumper. She was a performer, a storyteller. But she didn't just talk. She re-embraced the hardcore style that had made her famous, but in an environment that appreciated it as a style rather than a stunt. On June 2, 2006, at an NWA Wrestle Birmingham event, she achieved a familiar feat. She defeated a male wrestler, Big Daddy O'Malley, to win the NWA Wrestle Birmingham Junior Heavyweight Championship. It was a repeat of her WCW Cruiserweight success, a clear, defiant statement that she could and would compete on the same level as the men and win. She also took her talents to Women's Extreme Wrestling, WEW, dusting off her old, sinister Lucifer persona from the XPW days, proving she could still be the most terrifying woman in the room. In a move that showcased her incredible range, she also joined the campy, comedy-based Wrestlicious promotion as Draculetta. She was, in effect, rebuilding her brand, diversifying her portfolio, and reminding the entire industry of her unique, irreplaceable talent. By 2008, the landscape of professional wrestling had shifted dramatically. WWE was still the undisputed king, but a viable national competitor had finally emerged. Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, TNA. TNA, based in Orlando, Florida, right in Shannon's backyard, was making noise, and its most talked about, critically acclaimed and revolutionary division was its knockouts, led by visionary agent Dutch Mantell and featuring a roster of incredible hungry talent like Gail Kim, Awesome Kong, Mickie James, the one with her boots, Roxy and ODB. The Knockouts division was everything the WWE Divas were not. They were presented as serious, credible, violent, and compelling athletes. They were given time for 20-minute main events. Their storylines were treated with respect. It was, in short, the single greatest collection of female talent in North American history, and it was the perfect environment for a woman who had been rejected by WWE for not being a model. TNA wasn't looking for models. It was looking for wrestlers. Shannon's return to TNA was not a celebrated one. It was a literal tryout in front of a live crowd. On June 5, 2008, the monstrous, dominant Knockouts champion, Awesome Kong, continued her $25,000 challenge, where she would destroy a fan from the crowd. Out of the audience stepped an unnamed, seemingly terrified woman in jeans and a t-shirt. It was Shannon Spruill. The TNA crowd, savvy and loyal, recognized her immediately, and a Daffney chant broke out. Kong, in character, annihilated her. It was a brutal, one-sided beatdown, designed to make Kong look unstoppable. But the fan showed heart, so much heart, in fact, that she returned the following week and the week after that, demanding another shot. Each time, Kong would brutalize her, but she kept coming back, showing a fire and a toughness that impressed TNA management. This plucky fan angle earned her a TNA contract. But TNA, in a moment of baffling creative judgment that defined the company's often flawed Vince Russo era, didn't immediately capitalize on the Daffney name the fans were chanting. Instead, it was late 2008, the height of the U.S. presidential election. Alaska Governor Sarah Palin was a media sensation, a polarizing and instantly recognizable figure. In a move of ripped from the headlines comedy, TNA decided to repackage Shannon Spruill as the governor, a not-so-subtle parody of Sarah Palin. This was, by all accounts, a creative and professional humiliation. Here was Shannon, a 33-year-old battle-hardened hardcore pioneer. She was a trained actor, a former WCW champion, a respected independent veteran, and she was being forced to put on a business suit, pull her hair back, and do a broad, campy political impersonation. It was a gag, a throwaway comedy skit. She was placed in a feud with the popular, narcissistic, beautiful people, Angelina Love and Velvet Sky, who were the real stars. The storyline was that the governor was a joke, and she was treated as such, mocked, humiliated, and beaten down by the mean girls. This angle was, on its face, a creative disaster. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of her talent, but in a bizarre, backward way, it was the most effective setup possible. The story of the governor was one of public humiliation. She was a laughingstock. The audience was supposed to pity her, and this constant, simmering degradation, week after week, was building to a breaking point. Not for the governor, but for the woman and the monster she was repressing. The moment of her rebirth is one of the greatest snaps in wrestling history. On April 2nd, 2009, the governor was scheduled for a backstage interview segment with fellow knockout Taylor Wilde Taylor, playing the part of a concerned, good girl babyface, was trying to comfort her, speaking to her with pity, telling her it was okay that she was being humiliated by the beautiful people. As Wilde talked, something in the governor changed. The camera pushed in tight on her face. Her eyes, once comedically wide and perky, in her Palin parody narrowed. Her friendly, forced smile began to contort, to tremble. And then, as Taylor Wilde's pitying words hung in the air, she let it out. It was not the scream of the governor. It was the high-pitched, piercing, unhinged shriek of Daffney. The crowd in the impact zone, who had been sitting on their hands for the segment, erupted. They knew that sound. In one of the most brilliant pieces of subtle character work, she grabbed her own face, as if trying to stop the scream from escaping, as if she was horrified by what was coming out. She looked at her hands, confused, and then a slow, manic, evil grin, the true Daffney grin, spread across her face. She attacked Taylor Wilde, no longer a political parody, but a woman possessed. The Scream Queen was back. And she was born in violence. TNA management, realizing they had struck gold, immediately strapped a rocket to her. The governor gimmick was dead. This new reborn Daffney was a main event level threat. She was immediately paired with TNA's own resident monster, the 320-pound weapon of mass destruction, Abyss. This was a thematic masterstroke. Daffney, with her Harley Quinn-inspired madness, was the perfect psychological companion to Abyss's Jason-like brute force. She was the twisted intellect behind his monstrous power, his unhinged girlfriend. This alliance immediately catapulted her from comedy segments to high-profile, main event-adjacent storylines. Her first major match back as Daffney was at the Lockdown 2009 pay-per-view, in the first-ever Queen of the Cage match, a multi-woman steel cage bout. But it was her feud with Taylor Wilde, the woman whose pity had caused her to snap, that would define her year and revolutionize the division. The story was simple but effective. Wilde was the wholesome friend who had tried to fix her, and Daffney, in her new twisted persona, saw this as the ultimate betrayal. She turned full heel on May 14th, attacking Wilde and cementing her as one of the top villains in the division. This feud was destined to be more than just a series of matches. It was a mission statement. Daffney, now fully unleashed, was determined to prove that women could be just as extreme as the men. This led to TNA's groundbreaking decision, the first ever Monsters Ball match for the Knockouts, held at the Sacrifice pay-per-view in May 2009. The Monsters Ball was TNA's signature hardcore, anything-goes stipulation, a match synonymous with Abyss, Mick Foley, and extreme violence. It was a world of thumbtacks, barbed wire, and broken tables, and now, for the first time on mainstream American television, the women were going to have one. The match featured Daffney, Taylor Wilde, Roxy, another hardcore-leaning wrestler, and ODB. It was a brutal, chaotic, and revolutionary spectacle, and Daffney was its dark, beating heart. She was in her element. She took and dished out sickening punishment, flying around the ring with a manic energy. While she didn't win the match, Taylor Wilde did, she was its spiritual center. She had successfully brought the extreme to the women's division on a level that had never been seen before. But the feud with Taylor Wilde was far from over. The multi-woman Monsters Ball had only whetted the appetite for more. It had become TNA's most personal, violent women's rivalry. At Slammiversary on June 21, 2009, Daffney and Taylor Wilde would face each other one-on-one. And to up the ante, it was announced that it too would be a Monsters Ball match. This was her Mick Foley moment, the night she would etch her name into hardcore history. The match was a horrifying masterpiece of storytelling and physical sacrifice. Weapons were used with vicious intent, but one moment would define the match, her career, and, tragically, her entire life. In a spot that is still difficult to watch, Taylor Wilde pushed Daffney off the ring apron, but Daffney did not land on the protective floor mats. She landed back first into a pile of steel thumbtacks that had been spilled at ringside. The visual was sickening. The sound of the Impact Zone crowd's collective, visceral, holy shit chant was deafening. This was not a diva spot. This was not a bra and panties spot. This was a king of the deathmatch spot, a level of physical sacrifice that most men in the company would never even consider. The camera zoomed in on Daffney, screaming in legitimate, agonizing pain, with dozens of steel tacks embedded in her back, shoulders, and arms. That image of her writhing in agony, a human pincushion, became one of the most iconic in TNA history. It was her mankind moment, referencing Mick Foley's legendary fall from the Hell in a Cell. In one single horrifying bump, she had proven her commitment beyond all shadow of a doubt. She was not a scream queen in name only. She was living her gimmick, and she was paying for it with her body, in her own blood. This single act of sacrifice elevated her to a new level. Her alliance with Abyss and their new twisted manager, Dr. Stevie, the wrestler Stevie Richards, continued, and she found herself enmeshed in their main event feud with the hardcore legend himself, Mick Foley. At Bound for Glory in October 2009, TNA's biggest show of the year, Abyss faced Foley in a Monsters Ball match. Daffney was at ringside, an active participant in the chaos. And this is where the story pivots from peak to tragedy. This is the moment that planted the seed for the end. During the match, Daffney was not just a passive manager. She was a weapon and a target, taking bumps in a match filled with barbed wire and tables. In one of the match's most brutal spots, Abyss, her own partner, choke-slammed her from the ring's apron, over the ropes and backwards, onto a board wrapped in barbed wire. She was not a 320-pound man. She was a 130-pound woman. The whiplash was violent. Her head and neck snapped back, and the barbed wire ripped into her arm. But it was the impact, the sudden, violent stop, that did the real damage. When she was helped to the back, she was not selling her injuries. She was legitimately and severely hurt. She had suffered a deeply serious concussion, one of the first of many she would endure in TNA. She was, at this moment, at the absolute peak of her career. She was the most unique, most dangerous, and most talked about woman in professional wrestling. She had the respect of the locker room, the adoration of a loyal fan base, and a consistent high-profile spot on national television. She was proving night after night that women's wrestling could be whatever it wanted to be: gothic, violent, extreme, and utterly compelling. This was her peak. This was the dream she had chased through rejection, retirement, and ridicule. But the very things that had elevated her to this peak, the thumbtacks, the barbed wire, the chair shots, the relentless, cumulative, unprotected head trauma, were a ticking time bomb. The Scream Queen was at the top of the mountain, but the mountain itself was a volcano. The physical price for her art was being paid in installments, and the bill was about to come due in the most catastrophic, life-altering way. The next major injury she sustained wouldn't just be a holy shit moment. It would be the one that silenced her career and began the tragic, irreversible final act of her life. The peak of Daffney's career, her reign as the dark heart of the TNA Knockouts division, was built on a foundation of genuine, terrifying risk. The thumbtacks at Slammiversary 2009 were not a gimmick. They were dozens of steel spikes piercing her skin, a sacrifice she made willingly for her art and for the roar of the crowd. But the crowd's memory is short, and the demand for extreme is insatiable. The thumbtacks were just an opening act for a cascade of trauma that would, with methodical precision, dismantle her body and unravel her mind. The tragedy of Shannon Spruill is not a single event. It is a story of accumulation, a chronicle of a career that became a slow, agonizing breaking point. This breaking point began at Bound for Glory in October 2009, TNA's biggest show of the year. In the chaotic, weapon-filled Monsters Ball match between Abyss and Mick Foley, Daffney was, as ever, in the thick of it. She was not a passive manager, she was a participant. In one of the match's most brutal and replayed spots, Abyss, her 320-pound storyline partner, chokeslammed her from the ring apron over the ropes, backwards onto a flat-backed board wrapped in real barbed wire. The visual was horrifying. The whiplash to her neck and head was violent. The wire ripped into her arm, but the unseen damage was far worse. She was helped to the back, dazed and in agony. This was not a minor stinger. This was a severe, violent trauma to the head and neck. This was the first major publicly acknowledged concussion of her TNA run in the brutal, old-school culture of professional wrestling. A concussion is often seen as a badge of honor, a bell ringer you just tough out. You're expected to be back in the ring the next week, and if you complain, you're seen as weak or ungrateful for your spot. Daffney, a woman who had fought for a decade through 2 major rejections and a demeaning political parody to get this spot, was not about to complain. She was the Scream Queen. Her entire value to the company was wrapped in her toughness. Her willingness to do what the divas in WWE would not. Her gimmick had become a trap. If she was no longer extreme, she was no longer relevant. And so, with a brain that was still in all medical likelihood bleeding and swollen, she did not rest. She went back to work, and the company, in its pursuit of ratings, escalated the violence. Her next major feud in early 2010 was against Tara, Lisa Marie Varon, FKA Victoria in WWE. This was not a wrestling feud. It was a storyline built on mutual, escalating assaults. They were 2 veterans being asked to prove they were still hardcore. Their rivalry was built around toolbox spots and, infamously, a first blood match. a stipulation rarely, if ever, used for women in a mainstream American promotion, for obvious bloody reasons. The spots were not safe. They were not worked in the traditional sense. In one segment, Tara repeatedly slammed Daffney's head and face against a steel ring post. In another, during a first blood match, Tara, as part of the story, grabbed a steel wrench from a toolbox. The sound of the wrench making contact with Daffney's skull was sickening, a dull metallic thud that was far too real. This is the very definition of compounding trauma. A brain that has suffered a concussion is in an incredibly vulnerable state. A second impact, even a seemingly minor one, before the first injury has fully healed, can be catastrophic. It's known as second impact syndrome, and it can cause massive swelling, permanent brain damage, or even death. Daffney was not just having a second impact, she was having dozens, in the form of chair shots, wrench shots, and brutal bumps, all while her brain was still screaming for help from the Bound for Glory chokeslam. The daily headaches, the sensitivity to light, the fogginess, all symptoms she would later report were almost certainly beginning here, masked by adrenaline and the sheer terror of losing her job. The Scream Queen was a star, but Shannon Spruill was in freefall, and she hadn't even hit the ground yet. The ground, the moment that truly and irreversibly ended her career, was not a barbed wire board on TNA's biggest show of the year. It was a cold, empty arena hours before the show, in a meaningless, non-televised dark match against an inexperienced opponent. It was April 20th, 2010. The match was a tryout match for a new developmental talent named Miss Betsy, who was wrestling as Rosie Lottalove. Lottalove was at the time significantly larger than Daffney and, by all reports, dangerously green, a wrestling term for being new, unsafe, and unfamiliar with how to protect an opponent. Daffney, the 10-year veteran, was the gatekeeper, the one tasked with making the new girl look good and reporting back to management. The match, which would never air on television, was, by all accounts, a disaster from the start. It was sloppy, dangerous, and unprofessional. In one spot, Lottalove, attempting a powerbomb-style move, reportedly lost her grip. Daffney, weighing only 130 pounds, was dropped, landing with sickening force. But the critical, career-ending moment was a spot where Lottalove, sitting on the middle rope, was supposed to be hit by Daffney. Instead, the spot was botched. Lottalove fell backwards, landing on top of Daffney, who was on the ring apron. The combined weight and awkward, unplanned impact was devastating. Daffney lay on the floor, unable to move, screaming. Not the Scream Queen shriek, but a real agonizing cry of injury. She was rushed to the hospital. The damage was immediate and catastrophic. She had suffered a badly bruised sternum, making it painful to even breathe. She had suffered a severe stinger, a terrifying injury where the nerves in the neck and spine are violently stretched or compressed, sending a shooting, electrical pain and numbness down the entire arm. And on top of the barbed wire concussion and the wrench shot concussion, she had suffered another deeply severe concussion. This was the one that broke her. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was not a hardcore spot she had agreed to. This was not a calculated risk. This was, in her eyes, negligence. This was a rookie in an untelevised match who had, through sheer incompetence, taken everything from her. The spoiler report from that night's TNA Impact taping, posted by Pro Wrestling Insider, was blunt. Daffney was taken to the hospital after a dark match with Rosie Lottalove, reportedly suffering a stinger and a concussion. The match was said to have been a complete mess. The Scream Queen was gone. In her place was Shannon Spruill, the patient, and her new invisible daily life was a living hell. The details she would later share in books like Sisterhood of the Squared Circle, published in 2017, are harrowing. The concussions, now a tangled cumulative mass of injuries, had evolved into severe post-concussion syndrome, but the symptoms were, in hindsight, a textbook preview of the CTE that was ravaging her brain. She began suffering from constant debilitating migraines. She had vertigo so severe that she would have to crawl to the bathroom, unable to stand. The Scream Queen who lived in the spotlight was now, as she described, living in a dark room, with blankets taped over her windows because her sensitivity to light was so extreme it caused her physical pain. Her memory, once sharp, she was a GSU graduate after all, began to fail her. She would forget conversations, names, and what she was doing. This was the infamous cognitive fog of brain injury. She, a trained actor, could no longer remember her lines or her cues. Her bipolar disorder, which she had been managing, was now amplified beyond all control. A brain injury on top of a pre-existing mood disorder is a psychological accelerant. The depression was deeper, the anxiety was constant, and the emotional volatility was terrifying. Even to her, she was, in her own words, a prisoner in her own head. And what was the response from her employer, TNA, the company for whom she had taken thumbtacks, barbed wire, and wrench shots? On May 26, 2010, just over a month after being carried out on a stretcher, TNA's doctors medically cleared Shannon Spruill to return to the ring. This single act, this clearance, would become the central, devastating point of betrayal in her life. She knew she was not okay. She was living the symptoms. She was telling anyone who would listen that she was in constant pain, that her head wasn't right, but the machine needed bodies, and a doctor, under company employ, had ticked a box. This clearance was, in her view, not a medical assessment. It was a legal maneuver, a way for the company to absolve itself of responsibility. She was used sparingly after that, mostly in non-wrestling roles. She was damaged goods. The Scream Queen could no longer scream. The hardcore pioneer could no longer take a bump. She was a constant walking reminder of the price of the business. Her TNA contract came up for renewal on March 15, 2011, the company citing her injuries, and by this point her outspokenness about her condition let it expire. They did not re-sign her. After a decade of fighting her way in, she was out permanently. At 35 years old, Shannon Spruill was medically retired in chronic pain, mentally unraveling, and abandoned by the company she had given her brain and body to. When the barbed wire ripped her arm, she bled. When the thumbtacks hit her back, she bled. When the wrench hit her head, she bled. And when they were done with her, they threw her away. But Shannon Spruill was not just a military brat. She was a fighter, and this is where the tragedy pivots to controversy. She got a lawyer. In a move that sent shockwaves through the industry, Shannon Spruill filed a workers' compensation claim against TNA Wrestling, TNA Entertainment, LLC. This was not a simple injury claim. This was a broadside attack against the industry's entire broken system. For decades, major promotions like WWE and TNA have built a billion-dollar industry on the legal fiction of independent contractors. By classifying wrestlers as contractors rather than employees, they are not required to provide basic worker protections. No health insurance, no 401k, no paid time off, and, most critically, no long-term liability for the injuries sustained on the job. Daffney's lawsuit blew this system wide open. She wasn't just suing for her dark match injuries. She was suing for the accumulation of injuries. She claimed TNA had created and fostered an unsafe working environment, pressuring her to perform high-risk, extreme stunts that were outside the norm. More damningly, she alleged that the company was negligent in its handling of her injuries, specifically citing the fact that they cleared her to wrestle when she was clearly and severely concussed. She was, in effect, claiming that TNA knew she was hurt and put her back in harm's way anyway. As reported by Pro Wrestling Insider's Mike Johnson, this lawsuit was a massive deal. It wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. TNA predictably fought it. They moved to have the case dismissed, falling back on the independent contractor defense. They argued that as a contractor, she assumed the risk of her job. It was a cold, corporate, and terrifyingly standard defense. By filing this lawsuit, Shannon became a pariah. She was trouble. She was difficult. She had broken the code of silence, omerta, that demands wrestlers never ever sue the hand that feeds them. Many wrestlers, terrified for their own jobs but suffering from their own injuries, quietly supported her. But publicly, she was on her own. The legal battle dragged on for 2 excruciating years, and as the legal fight intensified, her personal life, already hanging by a thread, completely unraveled. On July 19, 2011, just 4 months after her TNA release, and in the thick of her lawsuit's preliminary filings, police in Hillsborough County, Florida, responded to a call Shannon Spruill, driving under the influence, had crashed her car. She was arrested for DUI with property damage. This was not a party girl getting into trouble. This was a classic, tragic, and textbook cry for help. This was a woman in constant, chronic pain. From her neck, from her sternum, from her head, self-medicating. This was a woman with a bipolar disorder, now amplified by a traumatic brain injury, making a reckless, impulsive, and desperate decision. She would later plead guilty, receiving a year of probation and over $1,500 in fines. The hits just kept coming. In 2012, as her lawsuit was still pending, she was involved in another serious car accident in Florida. This one was not her fault, but it resulted in even more physical trauma, more pain, and a deeper reliance on pain medication. She was in a vortex of physical pain, psychological torment, legal stress, and financial ruin. Her career was over. She was, as she stated publicly, unable to ever wrestle again. In March 2013, the lawsuit was finally, quietly settled out of court. The terms were, as they always are, undisclosed. She had won something. She had forced the company to, at the very least, acknowledge her claim and pay her to make it go away. But it was not a victory. It was an ending. The settlement, combined with her now well-documented injuries, effectively blackballed her from the entire industry. No major promotion would ever touch her again. She was 37 years old. The Scream Queen, a woman who had been on national television, a former champion, a pioneer who had changed the game for women, was now, in the eyes of the business, just Shannon Spruill, a medical liability, a legal risk, and a broken-down veteran. She had survived, but the cost was her career, her health, and, as the world would tragically find out years later, her mind. The injuries were permanent. The headaches were chronic. The damage to her brain was done, and it was just getting started. The next and final chapter of her life would not be about a comeback. It would be about a desperate, heartbreaking fight to simply, quietly endure. The year 2013 marked the end of one war for Shannon Spruill and the true, agonizing beginning of another. The out-of-court settlement with TNA Wrestling was, in every sense of the word, a hollow victory. The legal documents were signed, the undisclosed sum of money was transferred, and the public-facing battle was over. But the lawsuit, which had dragged on for 2 brutal years, was never really about the money. It was about accountability. It was about a company being forced to acknowledge the human wreckage it had left behind. And in that, there was no true victory. The settlement was, in effect, go-away money. Shannon Spruill, at 37 years old, was now a pariah in the industry she had given her body, mind, and entire adult identity to. By suing her employer, a cardinal sin in the tight-lipped, Carney-esque world of professional wrestling, she had effectively blackballed herself. WWE, the company that had already rejected her in 2003 for not being a diva, was certainly not going to hire a 37-year-old veteran with a known history of severe concussions and a reputation for suing, and TNA, the company she had just battled, was a bridge she had rightfully burned to the ground. Her in-ring career was over, not just because of the lawsuit, but because her body was fundamentally, permanently broken. But what does a performer do when they can no longer perform? What does a military brat trained her entire life to adapt do when she is faced with an obstacle that cannot be overcome, only endured? The answer for Shannon was heartbreakingly simple. She tried to stay as close to the fire as possible. She could not be in the ring, but she could be near it. Her love for the business, for the art form she had studied and sacrificed for, was too deep to extinguish. Even as her legal battle with TNA was raging, Shannon was already finding a new home, one that would have her. In 2012, she became a central figure in Shine Wrestling, a sister promotion to Shimmer based in her home state of Florida. This was not a coincidence. Shine was a promotion, like Shimmer, that was dedicated to showcasing female wrestlers as serious athletes. And they, unlike the corporate giants, were not afraid of her. They revered her. Her initial role was that of a hostess and color commentator. This was a perfect, low-impact position. It utilized her GSU education, her charisma, and her deep knowledge of the business, all while keeping her safely on the outside of the ropes. But the Scream Queen was not built to be a passive observer. The performer in her, the trained actor, needed a role. And so, she evolved. She transitioned into a heel manager, a classic wrestling archetype. This was a move of profound, almost tragic irony. The Scream Queen, the woman who was famous for her willingness to take the most brutal physical punishment, was now a manager who ordered other younger women to do her bidding. The woman who could no longer take a bump was now the one who screamed on the microphone, a general protected by her soldiers. She was brilliant at it. She formed a heel stable, a group of villains, and became the promotion's top antagonist, all without ever having to risk her fragile neck and brain. This period from 2012 to 2015 was a wilderness era, but it was a crucial one. It kept her connected. It gave her a purpose. It gave her a locker room to be a part of, a family to replace the one in TNA that had disowned her. But it was a far, far cry from the bright lights of Nitro or Impact. This was the independent scene, small, hot, untelevised arenas, often in front of fewer than 100 people for a fraction of the pay. It was a psychological, as much as a professional, come down. She was a legend, but she was a legend in exile. And all the while, the real war raged on, not in a wrestling ring, but inside her own home, inside her own skull. The lawsuit was settled, but the injuries were permanent. The money from the settlement, whatever it was, could pay for doctors, but it couldn't buy a new brain or a new spine. It could only pay to manage the pain, and her pain was all-consuming. In 2017, Shannon Spruill gave one of the most important and, in hindsight, most horrifying interviews of her life. She was a key contributor to the book Sisterhood of the Squared Circle, The History and Rise of Women's Wrestling. In her chapter, she did not hold back. She laid bare, in excruciating detail, what her daily life had become in the 7 years since that fateful dark match in TNA. This was not a bitter ex-wrestler complaining. This was a victim, sounding an alarm. She described with chilling clarity the symptoms of her traumatic brain injury. She confirmed that she was suffering from constant, debilitating daily headaches. These were not minor aches, they were blinding migraines that would lay her out for hours. She described the vertigo, a symptom she had never known before 2010. She would be sitting on her couch and the room would suddenly, violently begin to spin. A terrifying, nauseating loss of control that left her unable to even crawl to the bathroom. Most poignantly, she described her sensitivity to light. This is a classic hallmark symptom of severe post-concussion syndrome. The Scream Queen, who had lived her life under the glare of 1,000 television lights, was now a prisoner of the dark. She told the author that she had to keep blankets taped over her windows 24 hours a day because even the filtered Florida sunlight was too intense, causing her physical stabbing pain. This single image, a Gothic icon, self-exiled to a dark room, a recluse in her own home, was a devastating metaphor for what the business had done to her. She spoke of the cognitive fog, the memory loss. She, a woman with a college degree, would forget names, conversations, and simple tasks. She was terrified that she was losing her mind, a fear compounded by her bipolar diagnosis. Was this her mood disorder, or was this the TBI? The doctors couldn't always tell. The two conditions were now horribly intertwined, a perfect storm of neurological and psychological chaos, each one amplifying the other. She also became a vocal, passionate advocate, using her own story as a desperate warning. She implored younger wrestlers, especially women, to rest after a head blow. She begged them not to be tough, not to be like her. She knew and stated publicly that her TNA injuries were the direct cause of this daily torment. She was, in effect, handing the world the evidence for her own future autopsy. She was telling everyone exactly what was wrong, what had caused it, and what the inevitable outcome would be, but the industry as a whole was not yet ready to listen. The brain was not the only part of her that was broken. The physical toll of her career, the thousands of bumps she had taken from the WCW power plant to the TNA dark match, had also destroyed her spine. The stinger she suffered in 2010 was not a temporary injury. It was the symptom of a catastrophic failure in her neck. In January 2017, the same year her interview was published, Shannon underwent a major invasive surgery. She had to have her C5 and C6 vertebrae, two of the primary shock absorbers in the neck, fused together. This is an operation that has become a dark rite of passage for a generation of wrestlers. The same surgery that ended the careers of Stone Cold, Steve Austin, and Edge. The surgeons had discovered a massive extrusion on her spinal column. In layman's terms, a disc had not just slipped, it had exploded, sending material pressing against her spinal cord. This was the source of her constant chronic pain, the numbness in her arms. This was the cumulative result of a decade of chokeslams, chair shots, and finally, that one botched spot in a dark match. The surgery was a success in that it stabilized her spine. It likely prevented her from becoming paralyzed, but it did not fix her. It was a patch. It was another layer of trauma, another long, painful recovery, another mountain of medical bills. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, this prison of pain and fog, Shannon Spruill was not just a victim. She was a mentor, a friend, and a mother. She was, in these later years, a beloved and revered figure, especially to the new generation of female wrestlers. She was Aunt Daff. She built a new family. She became a mentor to many, but none more so than a young independent wrestler named Jamie Lynn Senegal, who she openly and lovingly referred to as her wrestle daughter. This relationship was a source of immense joy and purpose for her. She saw in Jamie a young, hungry performer, and she poured her knowledge, her love, and her protection into her. She was determined to ensure that this new generation would not make the same mistakes she did, would not suffer the same fate. This relationship and her friendships with other wrestlers like Leva, Blue Pants Bates, showed the person behind the pain. She was not a total recluse. She was a woman capable of deep, profound love who was fighting every single day to find a reason to stay. And the industry that had blackballed her, it began in small, bittersweet ways to let her back in, not as a competitor, but as a ghost, a beloved, nostalgic legend. In 2018, she made a surprise, poignant cameo at a Ring of Honor ROH show, the company she had worked for 15 years prior with CM Punk. She came to the ring to congratulate the new women's champion, Sumi Sakai. The fans gave her a standing ovation. She was Daffney, the legend she was home. And then, in the most staggering of ironies, she was invited to appear on the WWE Network. WWE, the company that had rejected her in 2003 for not being a diva model, the company whose corporate culture she was the antithesis of, now needed her. They were producing a 20th anniversary documentary special on Mick Foley, her old hardcore rival and friend from TNA. They were covering his 20 Years of Hell tour, and who, they realized, was more qualified to speak on hardcore wrestling, on TNA, and on Mick Foley than the Scream Queen herself. In 2018, Daffney appeared as a talking head, a respected historian, on a WWE production. It was a surreal, non-archival appearance. The company that had no place for Shannon Spruill, the wrestler, was suddenly very happy to have Daffney the legend lend her credibility to their network. It was a moment of validation, but it was also a gut-wrenching reminder of what had been taken. They wanted her story, but they had never wanted her. So, as the world shut down in 2020, this was the woman who faced the isolation of a global pandemic. She was a woman in her mid-40s. Her body was a roadmap of surgical scars, her neck held together by plates and screws. Her brain was a damaged, tangled mass of misfiring signals, a victim of CTE, TBI, and bipolar disorder, all at war with each other. She was in chronic daily pain, likely managed by a complex cocktail of medications. She was professionally adrift, a legend in a world that no longer had a place for her. She was isolated, not just by the pandemic, but by her condition. She was, quite literally, living in a dark room. The princess of the Scream, the girl who had traveled the world as a military brat, who had graduated college, who had become a champion, was now a prisoner. The final tragic act was not a matter of if, but when. The tragedy had already happened. A long, slow, agonizing decline over 10 years. The world was just about to see the epilogue. The pandemic simply removed her last remaining lifelines. The small independent wrestling shows where she could feel like Daffney for a night. The ability to see her friends, her wrestled daughter, Jamie Lynn Senegal. The simple human contact that kept her anchored. All of it was gone. She was now truly alone, left to spiral in a dark room with nothing but her physical pain, her bipolar disorder, and the cognitive emotional chaos of what we now know was chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Her only window to the world was the one that would broadcast her final tragic act, her phone. The night of September 1st, 2021, was the culmination of a decade of silent suffering. It was not a sudden, impulsive act. It was the final, logical, and, in her mind, only remaining step in a long, agonizing decline. Shannon Spruill went live on Instagram. This was not the Scream Queen. This was not a performance. This was a 46-year-old woman, her face puffy with tears, her voice trembling, broadcasting a raw, unfiltered mental health crisis to the entire world. She was in her apartment in Norcross, Georgia. She was rambling, reading from what appeared to be a suicide note, and she was holding a pistol. What followed was one of the most harrowing and uniquely modern tragedies in the history of public life. Hundreds, then thousands of fans, friends, and colleagues watched, horrified and utterly helpless, as the woman they loved systematically fell apart on their screens. "Do you guys understand that I'm all alone?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. This was the core, the epicenter of her pain. The military brat who had spent a lifetime trying to find a home, who had found a family in the wrestling locker room, and who had been blackballed and exiled from that family, was now confirming her deepest, most existential fear. She was alone, and in that aloneness the pain was unbearable. But this was not just a cry of despair, it was, in its own heartbreaking way, a final act of advocacy. It was a last-ditch effort to give her unbearable suffering a purpose. Through her sobs, she made a plea, a request she would repeat with desperate, lucid clarity. "Remember," she said, her voice stabilizing for a moment, "I want my brain to go to Boston University." She said it again. "Remember, you guys, my brain goes to Boston." This was the why. This was the entire point. In her final moments, Shannon Spruill was not just ending her life, she was creating her legacy. She was donating her own evidence. She was the key witness in the trial against her own career. She knew what had happened to her. She knew her pain was not just mental illness. She knew it was physical, tangible, and located in the damaged tissues of her own brain. The Bound for Glory chokeslam, the wrench shot from Tara, the dark match concussion that ended her career. She was now in front of thousands, drawing a straight, undeniable line from those moments to this one. She was, in her final act, trying to prove that her suffering was real, and she issued one last, haunting warning, a final selfless plea to the young wrestlers she had tried to mentor: "Don't you guys do stupid shit like me." As the world watched, a frantic, desperate rescue effort was mobilizing in the digital shadows. Her friends, seeing the live stream, were losing their minds. Jamie Lynn Senegal, her wrestle daughter, was on the phone, hysterically trying to get police to her, but was hampered by having old, incorrect addresses. The minutes felt like hours. In the wrestling world, panic was setting in. Mick Foley, the industry's conscience, took to Twitter in a state of public desperation. "If anyone has a way of reaching Daffney Unger, please check on her. She is in a bad place, suicidal." It was an unprecedented, terrifying public plea. He was, in effect, deputizing the entire wrestling world to find one of its own police were dispatched, but the address confusion cost them precious, critical time. They went to a previous address, they went to another. The clock was ticking. The live stream, after hours of horror, finally cut out. And then, silence. A deafening, terrifying silence that lasted through the night. The wrestling community held its breath, praying for a "she's been found, she's safe" update. It never came. The morning of September 2nd, 2021 brought the news everyone was dreading. After a frantic search, police in Gwinnett County, Georgia, had finally found the correct address for her apartment in Norcross. But they were too late. It fell to Lexi Fife, a veteran wrestler and one of Shannon's close friends, to make the official agonizing announcement, a task she performed with the family's permission. She was found, she posted, the pause hanging in the digital air. "My heart is broken." The official report from the Gwinnett County Medical Examiner's Office would later confirm the blunt, brutal facts. Shannon Claire Spruill, 46, was found deceased from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. The Scream Queen was finally tragically silent. The wrestling world did not just mourn, it convulsed. The reaction was immediate, a tsunami of grief, guilt, and horrified recognition. The industry, the one that had blackballed her, was now forced to look at what it had done. The first wave of reactions was predictable. Mick Foley, Kane, Glenn Jacobs, and dozens of other high-profile wrestlers flooded social media with links to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It was a well-intentioned, knee-jerk, and ultimately simplistic response to a problem that was anything but. CM Punk, her ex-partner from those early ROH days, posted a more pointed message. "Don't try to be there for your friends," he tweeted. "Be there for them." It was a message laced with the anger and guilt of an old friend who knew, perhaps better than anyone, the complexities of the woman they had lost. But the mental health narrative, as championed by Paige with the hashtag #MentalHealthMatters, was already taking hold. And it was, in a tragic way, missing the point. Shannon's tragedy was not just a mental health crisis. It was the end-stage symptom of a physical brain disease forced upon her by her profession. She hadn't just been sad. She had been brain damaged. This is what made her final plea so critical. And in May 2022, 8 months after her death, that plea was answered with a terrifying absolute vindication. People magazine ran the exclusive. The Gwinnett County Medical Examiner's report was made public, including the findings from Boston University's CTE Center. Her final wish had been honored. Her brain had gone to Boston. The results were unambiguous. Dr. Ann McKee, the world's leading expert on the disease, confirmed that Shannon Daffney Spruill had chronic traumatic encephalopathy. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof. This was the receipt for a decade of pain. The report was clinical, detached, and utterly damning. It described the telltale clusters of tau protein, the degenerative decay, the damage consistent with head impacts. Her symptoms, the migraines, the vertigo, the light sensitivity, the memory fog, the emotional volatility, the severe depression, were textbook end-stage CTE. Her diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which she had battled since 2003, had been a complicating factor, but the CTE was the accelerant. It was a lit match thrown into a room full of gasoline. The neurological damage had made her psychological condition impossible to manage. And with that report, Shannon Spruill made history one last time. She was, as the New York Post and other outlets reported, the first female professional wrestler to be publicly diagnosed with CTE. This news recontextualized her entire life, her difficult reputation, her lawsuit against TNA, her unsafe label. She hadn't been difficult, she had been sick. She hadn't been litigious. She had been injured. The company she sued, TNA, had not just fired an independent contractor. They had employed a woman with a progressive degenerative brain disease, cleared her to wrestle with that disease, and then discarded her when her symptoms, her pain, her memory loss, her advocacy became a legal and financial liability. It was and remains one of the most damning indictments of the independent contractor system in modern history. The industry that had abandoned her in life now rushed to claim her in death. The tributes were complex, a bizarre, uniquely wrestling blend of genuine love and profound corporate-level guilt. A celebration of life was held. Her real-life friends, the sisterhood she had built, came to mourn. Jamie Lynn Senegal, Leva Bates, Mia Yim, and, in a moment of heartbreaking full-circle poetry, Mickie James, the woman who had bought her boots when she retired the first time, now a multiple-time world champion, returning to say goodbye to the woman who had, in a way, passed her the torch. And then came the most surreal tribute of all Impact Wrestling. The company formerly known as TNA, the very entity she had sued for creating an unsafe working environment that led to her injuries, announced a special all-female show called Knockouts Knockdown. They dedicated the entire event to her memory. And what match did they choose to have on that show in her honor? A Monsters Ball match. The irony was staggering. The very stipulation that had defined her career, the stipulation that had given her the Bound for Glory concussion, the stipulation that was a stand-in for the extreme style that had destroyed her brain, was now being used as a tribute to her. It was a bizarre, almost grotesque, and yet uniquely wrestling way to process grief. It was, in their way, the only way they knew how to say, "We remember you. We honor your sacrifice." But it was a sacrifice they were still, in that very moment, celebrating. Perhaps the most raw and powerful tribute came on September 18th, 2021, just weeks after her death. Awesome Kong, one of Daffney's greatest TNA rivals, a fellow pioneer of the Knockouts division, was being inducted into the Impact Hall of Fame. It was the crowning achievement of her career, and in the middle of her speech, she stopped. She broke down, and she dedicated her own induction to Daffney Unger. "I know my Hall of Fame speech is supposed to be about me," Kong wept, "but there is someone who was a true pioneer, and I want to dedicate this to her." It was a raw, unscripted, and powerful validation. It was an acknowledgement from a peer, a legend, a sister, that Daffney's contribution had been real and that her loss was a void that could never be filled. The Scream Queen was silent, but her death, a death she had meticulously, tragically, and bravely curated, had become the loudest, most undeniable, and most consequential scream of her entire life. It was a scream that ripped through the industry, a scream that demanded change, a scream that proved the pain was real. And it was a scream that is, to this day, still echoing Shannon Spruill's story, will be remembered for two intertwined reasons. As Daffney, she was a true pioneer, a historic WCW Cruiserweight champion, and a foundational TNA knockout who proved, through thumbtacks and barbed wire, that women could be just as hardcore as men. But her most profound and lasting impact was not one she chose. Her final tragic plea for her brain to be studied led to a groundbreaking diagnosis, the first confirmed case of CTE in a female professional wrestler. This validation proved her decade of chronic pain, vertigo, and fog was a physical degenerative disease, forcing the industry to confront the undeniable brain trauma its female performers endure.